about people, she is talking about ghosts hanging around what some say is a real-life haunted house in Metro Detroit.
Haunted houses pop up all over the place this time of year.
A new Wall Street Journal report profiles the many parents who think they can see ghosts, specters, and mysterious movements on their advanced baby monitors.
Baby crib.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
You are tuned in to the Ghost Signal. Hello, dear listeners, spooks and specters, and welcome to the Ghost Signal. I bid you all good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are across the 24 time zones. My name is Jeff, and I will be your control operator for this episode, the thing hiding under the stairs when you have to go down to the cellar when the power goes out. If you have just found the Ghost Signal for the first time, I hope you like what you hear, but if you are a return listener, welcome back. This is episode 19, Don't Open Evil Inside Part 2, in which we will continue the story of the Tallmann family of Henriken, Wisconsin, and the terror of Larabee Street. We will also be creeping it real with another little story of haunted real estate out of Wisconsin. I guess this episode is really just a big love letter to the Badger State. If you like what you hear, please consider visiting theghostsignalpodcast.com, where you will find links to email me haunting tales of your own, to browse merchandise, to the Ghost Signal Patreon, and the path to the Discord server. Now, dear listeners, let's keep on creeping on.
Here's a question. Have you seen a ghost? Reports of ghost sightings and paranormal activity are on the rise this year.
It's a trend across Raleigh and the country. New at 11, CBS 17's Bridget Chapman getting answers about what it could be.
Experts say reports of paranormal activity are spiking this year. Claims of unusual noises, movements, and feelings. NOS says their emails about activity in people's homes shot up 50% in March.
If you've ever wanted to be the proprietor of a haunted hotel, you are in luck, as just such an establishment has gone on the market in Wisconsin. Located in the small town of Humbird and reportedly built over 150 years ago, the Humbird Hotel Bar and Grill features 6 guest rooms, a tavern, and if the accounts of visitors to the property are true, all manner of spooky spirits. People have experienced supernatural things in there, says realtor Julie Bonab, who noted the paranormal activity in her listing for the property, though conceded that I'm not sure if it's a positive or negative for prospective buyers. While it is understandably difficult to confirm whether or not a site is haunted, the hotel has perhaps the closest thing to a proverbial certification by way of multiple investigations which have been conducted there by the organization Supernatural Investigators of Minnesota. During one of their visits this past June, the group captured photos of an eerie black shadow that seemingly materialized in the hallway, and their prior investigations produced a handful of undeniably spooky EVPs. Beyond the ghost hunters' material are a myriad of accounts from people who have stayed at the hotel and reported seeing spirits, as well as experiencing the unsettling sensation of being watched by some kind of presence in the room. Sharing one story told to her by the building's current owners, Bonham recalled how, quote, they were sitting in the bar and there was this hanging light and it started to move when they were sitting below it. One person got up and stopped it from moving and said he could feel the force of somebody pulling it. so he sat down and it just continued to spin." End quote. The history of the hotel, which was built in 1869, has been somewhat lost to time, though the realtor speculates that it may have once served as a brothel due to its isolated location in a remote part of the state. The current asking price for the property is $279,900, and that includes all of the furnishings, the liquor license, and yes, the ghosts. There are so many bars, clubs, and pubs all across the globe that have a haunting reputation that it could be a theme for an entire season of this podcast. If you have any stories you'd like to share, I'm all ears. I'm sure the other listeners would like to hear them as well. I will put a couple pictures of the alleged shadow person on the website under the news tab so you can judge for yourself. When we left the Tallmann family on the last episode, Allen's mother had just seen something in the garage with glowing red eyes staring at her through the living room window. Prepare for dead air.
Dead air.
The most frustrating aspect of the couple's 20 months on South Larabee Street was their inability to identify any specific pattern of activity, of something, anything that would point to a cause for all of their problems. They desperately wanted to believe that perhaps it was a prankster that was responsible. The acts were too random, certainly, to connect them with the supernatural. Were the nervous animals simply misbehaving? Did Allen's mother really see tail lights? Was Allen confused about where he had left the paintbrush? Maybe the children were just being cranky, as children often are. Or perhaps it was something more, a slowly developing pattern of harassment by some sort of entity that for whatever reason had found a haven in the Tallmann home. On Friday, November 19, 1987, Allen, along with his father and brother, left on their annual weekend deer hunting trip to an area near Wisconsin Rapids, a city in central Wisconsin. Deborah didn't want to stay alone with the children. Her sister volunteered to stay with her at the house. Both Allen and Deborah weren't entirely convinced that someone wasn't harassing them and went so far as to put a lock on the door that opened onto the basement stairs. Allen still wondered about that mysterious incident with the basement window. But the house was quiet during Allen's absence and for the next week. On the following Saturday, November 27th, however, an accidentally watched scene from a television show started a new wave of anxiety in the family. "My mom was babysitting for the kids," Deborah said. "Mary Ann and Kenny were watching television. My mom was flipping through the channels when she turned on a show that had a big bonfire, and out of this fire came running a man wearing a pig's head. It must have been a horror movie of some kind. My mother changed the channel quickly, but not before Mary Ann noticed what was going on. When Deborah put her to bed later that night, the explicit television scene remained with the little girl. She told her mother that there was a fire in her room and somebody was watching her. She wouldn't settle down. Deborah had to sit with her until she finally fell asleep. The images of fires and men wearing animal heads plagued Mary Ann for several days afterwards. She cried about fires on the door, in the windows, and that something was hiding behind the door ready to pounce when the lights were turned off. A nightly ritual began whereby Mary Ann took a picture from the kitchen cupboard into her bedroom, put all the monsters inside, and then snapped the lid on the container. She then dumped the monsters into the garbage can. Deborah assured her daughter that they were all gone after that. The problems Allen and Deborah had with Mary Ann were never discussed with Kenny. He was fearful enough, Deborah said. We don't need to add to that. Once Mary Ann awoke so quickly in her lower bunk bed, she hit her head on the bunk above her. She cried about a fire on the door and came charging down the hallway and jumped into her parents' bed. Did the television images contribute to Mary Ann's nightmares? Her mother thinks that was only part of the problem. Deborah continued to hear her daughter laughing and giggling, saying something like, "Hi there," while the rest of the house was silent and dark. When the child became overtly frightened and joined her parents in bed, she would say, "It's coming," and then state matter-of-factly, "It's here, it's here." When her parents asked who or what was coming, Mary Ann got upset and wondered why her parents couldn't hear or see it. On the Sunday before Christmas, 1987, a new chapter was added to the family's woes, one that would presage their final flight. 8-year-old Kenny had an encounter with a mysterious figure, a 3-foot-tall, hideous-looking, wrinkled old woman. Kenny came into our room and said that he woke up to see this lady standing by his door, Deborah said. When I went with him to his room, I didn't see anything. He said she was very old, very ugly, and had a glow around her, like a fire. She had long black hair. I tried to tell him it was his imagination and he should just go back to sleep. About 5 minutes later, he called to me that she was standing there again. Deborah sat up with her son for the rest of the night. She couldn't convince him that it was either his imagination or, as she suggested, an angel come to visit him. She's too homely to be an angel, Kenny shot back. When Kenny left for school in the morning, Allen and Deborah had their first long conversation about the similarities between Marian's nightmares and Kenny's glowing woman. They also started comparing notes on all the bizarre occurrences over the past 18 months. I told him about Kenny and the little old lady and how she glowed like fire, Deborah said. We never mentioned anything to Kenny about what was happening to Marianne. The stories were just too similar, too coincidental to ignore. I started talking about how pale Kenny was and how my mom didn't like being in the house. The couple realized their lives were slowly coming unraveled, their children increasingly disturbed. Yet they were at a loss as to what steps should be taken. They considered selling the house, but thought better of it after they calculated the money they might lose in the transaction. Deborah decided that she would call their pastor Reverend Wayne DeBratz. If we had a ghost, the person you would call is a minister, Deborah said. Pastor DeBratz couldn't come over right away, but promised he would stop by as soon as possible. Other problems surfaced during the couple's discussion that morning at the kitchen table. Allen confided to his wife that he had a growing uneasiness whenever he came into the house. He had the impression something was waiting in the garage for him, watching his every movement. When he pulled down the garage door, Allen said it was like shutting himself in a tomb. One night as he walked from the garage into the house, he felt a tugging on the lunch pail he held under his arm, as if an unseen arm was trying to pull it away from him. So intense was his dread of entering the house that sometimes he was reluctant to even turn into his driveway. Deborah remained relatively untouched by the malevolence, but her biggest fear was seeing what was happening to her husband and children. They seemed to be the primary targets of the hostility. Pastor DeBratz's first visit to the house did not assuage the Tallmann's fear. We told him what was going on, Deborah said. We asked him if he had ever dealt with anything like this before. It was the devil, he said. Well, that upset us even more. We were already scared enough, but to think that the devil was in our house? The pastor wanted to know if anyone in the family had been dabbling with the occult or playing with the Ouija board, or had held a seance. The Tallmanns hardly knew what to say. They didn't dabble in any of that stuff. He convinced us that we had a spirit in our house. It was more likely that it was not the devil, but it was of the devil, and our house was cursed, Deborah recalled. He thought maybe somebody had gotten into our house, someone that had something against us, and put a spell on the house. Pastor DeBratz told Deborah and Allen to start attending church every Sunday. The family was nominally religious, but their attendance hadn't been on a weekly basis. It seemed like every time Sunday came around, our children were sick or I'd have been up all night and I was exhausted, Deborah said. But the family did start attending church regularly. The minister also suggested that the family recite prayers and read passages from the Bible to rid the house of the evil. They followed his advice. Allen and Deborah didn't believe the devil or his minions were responsible for what was happening to their family. Allen said he couldn't believe in his heart that the Lord would do something like that to him. We might not go to church all the time, and I use a little foul language every once in a while, but never have I done any bodily harm to anybody or ever threatened anyone. For my pastor to say we've got the devil in our house? But, at the family's request, their pastor returned to South Larabee Street and blessed the house. All was quiet until a few days before Christmas. Kenny had been allowed to sleep on the couch in our living room because he was so frightened to go to his room at night, Deborah said. We always left the light on, and when he slept he faced our Christmas tree. I could see him from our bedroom. We had all gone to bed as usual when at about 3:30 in the morning Kenny called out to me that the ghost was in the living room. I got up to look but didn't see anything. He said she had been right where I was standing. I went back to bed, but no more than 5 minutes later he said she was back again, and she had gotten bigger. Again Deborah ran into the living room. Kenny said the figure vanished just as his mother reached him. When it happened a third time, Deborah, frustrated and shaken, remained in her bedroom. Kenny said she was looking at him, Deborah said. She was standing by the Christmas tree. When he asked her what she wanted, she just stared at him harder. I heard him say, "Why don't you just go away and leave us alone?" That's when I came back out into the living room. He was so scared it was like he was paralyzed. Deborah fully believed her little boy. He was wide awake. She had heard him shouting at something. His fear was too real. But who this phantom woman was, and why she had menaced Kenny, was a mystery. Perhaps it was the same diminutive figure he had seen some months before, his mother surmised. Deborah said there was a little doubt in our minds after Kenny saw that little lady. I didn't want to put up with any more of it. I had all I could take. The kids were paranoid. They wouldn't let me go to the bathroom. They wouldn't go to the bedrooms themselves. I had to constantly take them almost everywhere I went. They always got frightened. After a point, you can't explain these things to children anymore. I couldn't tell them to not be afraid because I was scared myself. The minute it got dark out, the house was in chaos. The girls were screaming. Kenny was yelling. I couldn't put Marianne and Sarah to bed because Kenny couldn't stay in the living room by himself. The more Allen thought about what Pastor DeBrat said, the angrier he became, barely able to concentrate at work. He decided to go after the evil himself, if indeed that was the cause of his family's turmoil. I came home, and at the top of my lungs I yelled for whatever it was in my house to leave my children alone. I said if it wanted to fight, it could fight with me. That was not the right approach. Everything just got worse. I went to work the next day, but that night I had a dream about a child near a fence line. I didn't know the child, but it was at somebody's farm in the country. As I was driving my car down the road, I stopped to watch him playing around by a barn. I looked across the fields and it was lightning and thundering, so I thought I'd better watch the child because there was no house around. I looked up into the sky and saw a funnel cloud come down and start racing across the field. The wind was howling and whistling. I ran to grab the child and got him into the car, but he got back out. He wasn't going with me. About a mile up the road was our house. I couldn't worry about him anymore because he didn't want to come with me, so I drove quickly to my house to get my own children. But when I got there, they were gone. There was nobody there. I kept looking back and the tornado was coming, but there was nothing left in our house. Allen awakened from the nightmare in a cold sweat, nervous and frightened by the vivid dream. What, if anything, did it mean, he asked himself. An innocent child? Howling tornadoes bearing down upon Allen and the little boy? A house deserted? Dreams could foretell the future, he once heard. Could his lucid nightmare be connected in some way to the mysterious events plaguing his family? Allen arrived home from work just before 1 o'clock a few days later on Thursday, January 7th, 1988. The house was dark, save for a nightlight in the kitchen. As he put his key in the front door lock, a faint whistling followed by a gust of wind came from the direction of the garage door. The breeze became stronger as he turned the door handle to go inside. He thought immediately of his earlier dream. From somewhere a voice called out, "Come here!" Allen jumped off the porch and ran to the side of the garage. He thought someone was hiding there trying to scare him. He didn't see anyone near the house. The street was empty at this hour. He strained his ears to catch the sound of running feet, but nothing disturbed the cold, bleak night. I stood out there maybe 5 or 10 minutes, Allen said. My wife and children were in the house, so I knew it wasn't them, but I had to find out where this voice came from. I just couldn't find anything, so I started back up the sidewalk to the porch when it started again, a howling noise. I started to put my key into the lock when that voice said, "Come here" again, only it was really loud this time. Allen quickly looked back over his shoulder. I saw this glowing coming from the garage. It got brighter and brighter. I backed off the porch, but it seemed to draw me nearer to it. Flames were coming out of my garage, and then the eyes appeared in the overhead door. Shimmering green eyes, punctuated with blood-red pupils, seemed to float in the wide door. Eyes that matched the description of those seen by his mother several months before. I really don't know how I got the door open so fast, but when I did, I ran inside and slammed the door shut, Allen recalls. For several seconds, Allen leaned trembling against the doorframe, listening to see if the commotion had awakened anyone else in the house. It hadn't, but then a terrifying thought occurred to him. I said, "Oh my God, my garage is on fire." I opened the door and ran back out. There was no wind, no phantom voice beckoning Allen to move closer. The garage was dark. He walked slowly down the sidewalk towards the attached garage. He really couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Nothing out of place, all things quiet and peaceful. He peered through the garage window but could see only the dim outlines of bicycles, tools, and outdoor furniture stored along the walls. He turned and ran back into the house, bolting the door after him. My lunch pail was sitting on the floor by the front door. I picked it up and started walking towards the kitchen when it seemed that somebody came up from behind and slammed against me. My lunch pail went flying across the room, hit the table leg, and opened. My thermos bottle rolled out across the floor. Allen quickly picked up the spilled contents and ran into the bedroom, sensing all the while that this thing was right behind him. Deborah had finally awakened at the racket coming from the living room. He came flying into the bedroom, threw his keys on the dresser, jumped into bed, and just laid there, she said. Allen stared at the yawning doorway as if in anticipation that his tormentor would soon appear. Suddenly, Allen sat up straight. "Can you hear it? Can't you hear that howling?" Deborah shook her head. She was truly terrified for herself, for her family, and especially for her husband, who seemed on the verge of collapse. She grabbed him by the arm and demanded to know what he had heard. "It sounded like it was growling at me," Allen said later. "But I think it was more the sound of that wind. It was just a howling, whistling noise. It would be real high and then go very low. It was right there in the bedroom. I didn't see anything, but I could hear it all the time." Allen got out of bed and turned on every light in the house. The couple stayed awake until dawn. They were terrified. None of the children awoke, even though Allen wandered through the house for hours, telling it to leave him and his family in peace. It seemed like this thing was zeroing in on one person, Allen said. It would tune everybody else out and then keep them sleeping. On this night, Allen was the target. Remembering that traumatic night, Deborah said, "Allen is not a person that scares very easily, and I'm not either, but he was absolutely terrified." Allen fell exhausted into bed at daybreak. Deborah stayed up to get Kenny ready for school. None of the children knew what had happened to their father, although Kenny sensed the next day that his mother was very upset, but she refused to tell him what was wrong. Allen contemplated drastic measures. I can remember one night shortly after that incident with the garage door when I came home thinking that I was right on the edge of losing control. I was going to put shells in my deer rifle and wait for this thing. Just blow it to hell. But Deb stopped me. She said, "It's not something you can shoot, you dork. You can't kill it." After Allen's challenge, he realized the evil force was focusing even more intently on him. I'd feel this thing as soon as I got to the door. It was like somebody was trying to shove me back out. I wouldn't even go through the attached garage anymore. And once I did get inside, I couldn't sleep. Or if I did get to sleep, it would wake me right back up. I'd walk through the house and it seemed like it was always there, but I never could see anything. And that was really working on my mind. I'd be at work and think about it constantly, hour after hour. Everybody was at home and there I was. I'd get off work and be fine, but then I'd get down to that street and this thing was there to meet me every single night as soon as I pulled in the driveway. It would never show itself to me, but it was there. Each night the couple latched all the windows, locked and barricaded the doors going into the basement and garage so they wouldn't rattle in the middle of the night, another regular occurrence that they tried to ignore. Deborah said Allen was going to buy metal bars to put on the basement windows. I told him that whatever was happening, it was not coming from outside our house. Barring the windows wasn't going to keep it away. Locking the doors wasn't going to keep it away. By pushing the chair up against it, the door wasn't going to rattle, but something else was going to happen. It was going to continue to be there no matter what. The family had turned from keeping a single light on at night while they watched television to having every lamp in the house ablaze from dusk till dawn. With Allen at work each night, Deborah was dealing with 3 terrified children who followed her every movement around the house. Deborah tried to persuade Allen that they should move away right after Kenny's encounter with the strange woman. Allen resisted leaving. He thought that somehow they could figure out what was going on. I told Allen that when he went to work, he was safe, Deborah said. He didn't have this happening, this constant pressure. Allen's attitude towards the events always fluctuated from day to day. When there was a period without odd events, he would settle down and be encouraged that his family could somehow survive South Larabee Street. When the sun shone and the world seemed a bright, cheerful place, the Tallmanns breathed easier. Neither did they ever question their own sanity. "We knew that we were all right," Deborah said. "Something was happening to us." The Tallmanns just didn't know what it was. A human agent was still very much a possibility to them. They believed someone might have had a grudge against them and was using black magic or witchcraft or trickery to get even. Pastor DeBrat said it was a possibility. However, neither Allen nor Deborah could think of anyone who would want to harm them. Especially disturbing was the idea that someone would want to hurt or frighten their children. Though the couple were natives of the region, they were newcomers to Hurricane itself and didn't know that many people. With 3 small children and a modest income, they rarely socialized, except at family gatherings and a rare dinner out. The family's final days in the house were filled with strange and intense events that became, in the end, the breaking point. On Friday night, January 8th, 1988, Jonathan, a 16-year-old relative of Allen, spent the night at the house so the two could get up early the following morning and go ice fishing. At about midnight, the teenager walked into the kitchen to look for a snack. The refrigerator door was standing open. That may not seem extraordinary until one realizes that the floor levelers at the back of the refrigerator were broken, so the unit actually leans backward. Thus, the door always swings shut when it is opened. Or it did, anyway. That wasn't the only strange incident during the teen's visit. Late Saturday afternoon, January 9th, after a morning of ice fishing, Jonathan loaded his suitcase into the Tallmann's car, parked in the driveway so Allen could drive him home. As the boy headed back into the house, he noticed a floating red light through the garage door window. It seemed to hover near the ceiling of the garage. When he got back inside, he asked Allen if he kept a light on in the garage. Puzzled, Allen walked out to the garage to have a look around, but found nothing to account for the light. By the end of the day, odd lights would be the least of the Tallmann's troubles. After Allen returned from taking the boy home that evening, Deborah, as usual, asked him for help in putting the girls to bed. She was very upset about what had happened to Allen's young relative. Deborah said, "I wouldn't go back there by myself to put them in bed, so Allen and I both went. I was praying to let whatever was happening be gone." The girls were almost sleeping. Kenny was in the living room and he kept calling, "Are you coming out? Are you coming out?" So I went out there to do some housework and Allen stayed in the room. The next few minutes were a turning point for the family, according to Allen. On normal nights when we'd put the girls in bed, they would put up a fuss for about an hour or so. They would stay awake or they'd raise their heads up. They'd look to see if we were still there. They didn't want to go to sleep until they got to the point where they just couldn't hold their eyes open anymore. Well, for some reason that night the girls were relaxed and they went right to sleep. I was lying on the floor about ready to get up when I heard this high-pitched sound just like I heard the night in the garage, kind of like a vacuum cleaner. I sat right up and looked, but it died back down. I lay back down and it came back. I thought it was something in the furnace pipes. What Allen heard had nothing to do with furnace pipes or anything else of a mechanical nature. For the first time, Allen saw the face of the evil on Larabee Street. Rising from the carpeted floor came a fog. At first less than a foot in height, the misty substance grew until it reached nearly to the ceiling. Allen shrank against the wall as the vapor took on form, a human figure shimmering in the corner of the room. A head took shape, with 2 penetrating red eyes and sickly green pupils fixed intently on Allen. A translucent arm rose from the body and pointed as the wraith moved toward him. A voice, as if from the grave, issued from the thing. "You're dead." Now that's what I call a cliffhanger. Holy moly. If you've made it all the way to the end, you have my sincerest gratitude, dear listeners, spooks and specters. With the paranormal podcast market as oversaturated as it is, it's difficult to get noticed. But if you like what you hear, please spread the word and leave a review. Visit the website, theghostsignalpodcast.com, to drop me a line, get into the Discord server, or check out the Ghost Signal Patreon. The Ghost Signal is executively produced by Jason Wilson. Patreon by Brooks Bigley. Creative direction by Cassie. Custom sound beds by GM Scherf. And video editing by Hale. And I'm your ghost host with the most, Control Operator Jeff. Next time on the Ghost Signal is the end of the story. Until then, dear listeners, ending transmission. Reach me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Grey Rooms production. Copyright 2021 and 2022.
The ghost signal is lost. Transmission terminated.